Hello and welcome to today's video. In today's video I'm going to be discussing the ethics of necessity. The ethics of necessity are the idea that something is ethical as long as it's necessary. This is quite an interesting idea because it balances certain principles and certain Machiavellian principles with overarching morality that usually comes from Christians. This video I'm trying to explain and advocate the ethics of necessity as a practical and humane ethical system to adopt in politics, because especially people on the right generally will hold to their ethics no matter what, and that can be quite destructive because your political enemies don't. Your political enemies normally will have adopted the mantra that ends justify the means, and maybe even go further than that and take action that is not necessarily necessary but is for their own sadistic pleasure. And I'm hoping that adopting and internalising the ethics of necessity will be something that many right-wing leaders or sensibly centrist leaders can adopt, because it's a very useful ethic to have. Machiavelli, in his book The Prince, said that ends justify the means. What this is saying is, Machiavelli in the book The Prince essentially lays out how one should rule. And his main point in that book is to explain that the good Christian king is a fantasy. The good Christian king is dead on the floor. And what Machiavelli is getting at when he says the ends justify the means is, if a goal is worth pursuing, you cannot achieve that goal if you stick to your ethics unwaveringly, and if you do, your enemies certainly will not. That will obviously lead to you losing your goal and perhaps being killed. So when Machiavelli discusses the ends justify the means, what he's saying is, if a goal is worth achieving, you will have to compromise your ethics, because if you don't compromise your ethics for political victory or to achieve a goal, you're going to end up losing because your enemies won't. Sovereign is they who makes the exception. This Carl Schmitt discusses in The Concept of the Political and Political Theology. What Carl Schmitt is getting at here is a sign of political power, and especially sovereign political power, is that you, the sovereign, can make the exception on ethics, laws, and whatever you so choose. That is the sign of sovereign power. It's important that this is internalised by the sensible centre, because in terms of making the exception, it's something that the sensible centre doesn't do enough, because making the exception and compromising your ethics for the greater good is not only necessary, but it's inevitable if you wish to hold power. It's important to consider when discussing this that it can be very difficult to know when it is worth compromising on your ethics and when is not. The issue I would say for most people, and most people on the sensible centre have, is there's a very distinct stigma among the sensible centre with compromising your personal ethics. This idea is that by compromising your personal ethics you become just as bad as your political enemy. I would disagree with this. In my view, and to some extent in ancient literature, there is the view that is maybe not expressly displayed or shown throughout myths, legends, but it certainly exists as an implied view that there is a certain sense of hubris and cowardice in sticking to your ethics no matter what. This is because if you stick to your ethics no matter what, and your enemies don't, your enemies have a political advantage over you. So it's quite dangerous to stick to your ethics no matter what, especially if you have enemies who are not going to do the same. This theme is implied throughout most history and most myths. I'm going to discuss some historical examples of this, but what I'd like to say is, what I hear a lot from mainly Christians is you can't compromise your ethics, or you should try not to, because then and it damages your soul. But the issue with this is it's quite cowardly, because if you're not willing to damage your soul to prevent others from doing so, that's quite cowardly. That's very cowardly. Whereas if you're willing to do that so others don't have to, that is quite noble. It's important to consider that when balanced with the ethics of necessity, you don't necessarily have to be brutal or be as brutal as to your enemies as they would be to you. You just have to take what action is necessary. I'm going to go through some historical examples of people who've suffered as a result of people not acting on the ethics of necessity. Mehmed the Great, the conqueror of Constantinople, went to war with his childhood companion, Vlad the Impaler. Before Vlad the Impaler went to war and revolted and used Wallachia and had a revolt, Vlad the Impaler had shown disrespect and a clear willingness to kick out the Ottoman Empire of Wallachia. Mehmed the Great didn't take action on this, and as a result he had to put down a revolt in Wallachia, which cost thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of men, women and children their lives. If Mehmed II had taken action and stopped Vlad the Impaler from taking Wallachia, in all likelihood those people wouldn't have died. And you can argue that that is an example of Mehmed being too sentimental and not Machiavellian enough. But there is a certain aspect, especially for the powerful, with Machiavellianism is quite virtuous in a sense, because if you act in a Machiavellian way, you're likely to hold power, and power is to be stable, and providing you try to be a fair ruler, it's better that you compromise your ethics, certainly among the elites, to preserve peace. The example of the cost of sticking to your values is quite prevalent in Harry Potter, and it's also quite prevalent in classical literature as well. So, in the Iliad, Achilles, by sticking to his values and not allowing forgiveness, causes Achilles to lose Patroclus, and also many in the Greek army die when they didn't have to. The best example of Harry Potter sticking to his ethics to the expense of other people's lives is in book 3, The Prisoner of Azkaban. Harry Potter refuses to kill Peter Pettigrew or allow Sirius or Lupin to kill Peter Pettigrew, and a year later Peter Pettigrew, who allows Voldemort to return and is essential for Voldemort to return. Whereas if Peter Pettigrew had been killed, Voldemort would have never come back. This is a constant theme throughout the series. Harry Potter refuses to kill Death Eaters, and in The Half-Blood Prince he has the opportunity to kill many Death Eaters. And if he'd have done so, Tonks, Lupin, and maybe even Sirius still would have survived. So what I'm trying to display here is that sticking to your ethics in an unwavering way, when others will not, is more than likely going to directly harm people you care about. In ethics and your ethics, and sticking by them, moral consistency should be something you only give to people who are your political friends or are friends, people who will honour the same thing to you, whereas your political enemies aren't going to. And I don't see the point in allowing your friends, your political friends, whether your family and people you care about, to suffer so that you can have moral high ground. I mean, I shouldn't really say this because I'm a Christian, but moral high ground doesn't really matter when you're dead. I mean, obviously to some extent it does, because I believe in an afterlife. However, it's quite interesting because, as I say, there is a certain selfishness to sticking by your ethics unwaveringly. Because if you're doing it, as a lot of Christians do, for the preservation and the health of your soul, it's not really a selfless act. Sticking by your ethics, it's selfish. And selfishness is a sin. It's a sin that all men have and all men will continue to have. I also want to talk about President Snow in the Hunger Games, because this is another character who does what is necessary. So, in the last book, President Snow, the Mockingjay book, says to Katniss before he's about to be executed at the end of the book, "I'm not above killing children, but I'm not wasteful." And I think this is a very important guideline for the ethics of necessity, and I'm not suggesting that sensible interests should kill children, but in war, there are certain necessities that would go against every ethic that most right-thinking people have, but still, it is necessary to break with those ethics temporarily. So, an example I'll give of something that is wasteful and unethical is the policy of area bombing in World War II. That did not need to happen. If those bombers, those British bombers and American bombers, had been used to take out U-boats and bomb German ships, it would have been, or the war would have been over far quicker than it was, and Europe wouldn't have been destroyed, or much of Europe wouldn't have been destroyed. So I think the ethics of necessity is a good balance, because doing whatever you want to win probably is a very bad thing to do for your soul, whereas doing what is necessary, I think, is still probably bad for your soul. However, I would rather take on that burden than have anyone else do it. And it's important to note, with regard to the ethics of necessity, people who make decisions that are hard and what's necessary should be limited to the elites. The best thing about the ethics of necessity and having a just ruler who will stray from his ethics is the peasantry don't have to, the middle class don't have to. The level of sin that comes with holding political power, if it's confined to the elites, then hopefully it will be better, and it will be for the greater good, and it will allow for the health of more people's souls. Thank you for watching. This is a bit rambly, but if you want to improve your public speaking skills, please check out my Locals channel, which I'll link below, and also if you want articles on political and legal strategy, please check that out.